Hey friends, it's great to see everybody here this morning on this. It's a little chilly outside. I didn't know my car could tell me that it's negative degrees. I was amazed by that. But we are just blessed and excited. I'm thrilled to see everyone gathered here on a morning such as this. But Reverend Dr. Mark Holland, I know many of you are familiar with Dr. Holland, is here to offer a presentation, and it'll be a presentation followed by questions. Yep. And so as he's talking, be kind of thinking through a few questions you may have regarding any number of things, but specifically, 2024 General Conference and some of the plans for the future of the United Methodist Church. I'm always amazed at people's expertise at these things. I can't imagine ever being a delegate, for instance, just because there is so much to sift through and to think about, and particularly as we are kind of at a crossroads of our denomination regarding what path forward do we really want to take to be one that is fully inclusive, is fully demonstrating the love of Christ, and one that we can, scale back some of the, I would just say, bitter divisiveness that so many of us in the denomination has experienced. And so I'm excited for Reverend Holland to be offering this presentation, and I will just turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. And remind me the time frame, because you start worship
at 11 o'clock.
Give you enough time to make your way upstairs. But thank you, Jeff, for hosting, and to the Asbury group. This has been a very supportive congregation through the years for Mainstream UMC, so I appreciate you all coming out. And as I looked at my card and it said -9 this morning, I said, no one's coming. But here you are, so thank you all for making it out. I'll give a little bit of background about how we got to where we are in the church, and a little bit of background about where we might be headed for General Conference 2024. It can be super complicated, and so if you're confused by a lot of it, you're in good company, because a lot of us are. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's very difficult. I'll say a couple of housekeeping things. There is a sign-up sheet in the back. If you don't already receive my emails and you would like to, you can sign up in the back. There are also, I give away a free souvenir for everyone who comes. Right? That's great. And I have another souvenir that you can send back to me, which is an envelope if you'd like to make a contribution to Mainstream. I also offer people, you should sign up ahead of time, but then if you change your mind after you hear me talk, you can scratch your name back out, and I won't add you to the list. But I'm glad you're here. I am a third-generation United Methodist pastor here in Great Plains, originally Kansas East. My father pastored for a number of years, 40 years, in the Kansas East Conference. And I served for the last 19 years. I was at Trinity United Methodist in Kansas City, Kansas. Well, for 19 years I was there. For the last 5 years I've been doing Mainstream. And so I've been a part of Mainstream. And I've done a few other things here and there in between. But I also was involved in local politics in Kansas City, Kansas for 10 years, and state politics for 2. I like to, when we talk about the church, I like to paraphrase our Lord and say, where 2 or more are gathered, there will be politics also. Yes. And the General Conference is an inherently political operation. It's a legislative body, which means people are elected to serve, and then they go and then they vote on the different processes. So when you have an electoral system like that, politics can be good or bad. Yes, we've witnessed both. And at its best, it's how people get things done. It's how people work together. So General Conference, there are about 860 delegates. There's a maximum of 1,000. It gathers every 4 years, or is supposed to, unless there's a pandemic. And not anyone ever imagined that we wouldn't have a General Conference. There are no provisions in the Book of Discipline in the event that the General Conference can't meet. So we had no provisions for extending the budget, no provisions for extending leadership of people who are cycling off. Any of you praying to cycle off a committee one day? Right? I know how this works. I've played this game. But we had no provisions for how to enact during COVID. So the General Conference that was supposed to meet in 2020, as you know, was postponed. This is technically the 2020 General Conference is going to happen. The bishops have called for a special session in 2026 because regardless what happens in 2024, we're going to need something in 2 years to either enact or clean up. And then our next regular session will be in 2028. So we will have 3 general conferences in the next 4 years, which is just frankly too many. But it's a logistical issue because part of why it was postponed in 2020 was not just because of the pandemic, but because of the impact the pandemic had on international delegates arriving to the United States and getting visas. It really shut down the visa program, and we're concerned that the visas are going to be a problem this time. So I'll give you a little bit of background. The United Methodist Church was formed in 1968. It was merged with the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Episcopal Church. That merger then, at that time, in the late 60s, 98% of all the delegates for the General Conference came from the United States. It was basically a U.S. church. And we had missionaries that we sent around the world to all different places and had been doing that for years. By the 1980s, well, in 1972, then 4 years later, 1972 was remarkable because the General Conference removed the prohibitions from a pastor being divorced and added the prohibition that you can't be gay. So they took a passage from Matthew and took half of it and said that's no longer valid, but this half is. And so we're going to say that the language was inserted in 1972 that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That later they just discerned that people were, that gay people might want to be pastors. So they made a prohibition about gay people being pastors, and they said it this way: you can't be a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which simply means we entered a time of don't ask, don't tell, which has its own damaging impact on the church. Then later they saw that people were starting to get married, and so they added a prohibition that you could not do weddings in the church, and actually United Methodist clergy can't do a wedding anywhere for a gay couple. It's a chargeable offense that could lead to your losing your credentials. So, and then later on, they added a funding ban that you couldn't even spend any money that would promote homosexuality. I don't know what promoting homosexuality looks like, but it's illegal. We're against it. So all these provisions have been added through the years. It's interesting that if this were a US only vote, and the United States delegates were voting, these prohibitions would have been removed 12 to 16 years ago, like they were in the Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopalian, UCC churches. The US denominations, Protestant denominations, have all removed these prohibitions against clergy and marriage. And it's interesting that they've done this in large part because it's US only. While all of those denominations have churches outside the US, they're not under the same organic umbrella. And the interesting reason that the United Methodist Church remains the largest church in the world that ordains women, that does not ordain gay and lesbian people, is because of this unique kind of international structure that we have, which is under duress right now. So I said in the late 60s, 98% of the delegates were from the US. By the mid 80s, there were about 8% of the delegates who were from outside the United States. Today, it's 45%, and in 2028, it'll be 55%. And the change has come this way because when originally when we would send a missionary out and we would form a provisional annual conference in another country, that would grow to a certain size, and then the church would kind of spin it off and it would become autonomous, and it would become its own autonomous United Methodist Church. Well, that happened everywhere in this hemisphere. So all the Methodists in Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America are all autonomous Methodists. All of the Methodists in India and China, Korea, Australia, that whole part of the world are all autonomous Methodists. Britain, they're the mothership, we're autonomous from them. And there are about 10 million Methodists in Africa. Half of those are autonomous and half are United Methodist. And the reason for this is the ones that are autonomous came of age before the 1980s and 90s. But in the 1980s and 90s, we made a decision to stop spinning off churches from outside the United States and to start absorbing them into the United Methodist Church. And there are really three reasons. One reason is legitimate, and that is the United Methodist Church in the U.S. is about 89% white middle class. Right? Here. So adding international diversity, global diversity, I think makes us a richer church. It adds a lot of cultural diversity and is good for the United States in terms of, and good for the whole church to be together in one denomination. The other two reasons are not as pleasant, and they require different levels of cynicism, so we'll see how cynical you're feeling. When it's 9 below, I can be pretty cynical. So one reason is that starting in the 1960s, the United Methodist Church in the United States began to decline numerically. By adding churches outside the United States, we're no longer a declining denomination, we're now a growing denomination. The second reason is there were people at General Conference who realized that by absorbing these new annual conferences, we were receiving reliably conservative votes at the General Conference. And so there was a motivation to go ahead and retain people instead of having them be independent. Well, the result has been obviously this exponential growth that I just described about how the church outside the United States is growing exponentially. The church inside the United States, like Europe, is struggling. And with a major cultural shift that's happening in our country, which would be a whole nother interesting topic that we will spend the rest of our lives sorting out, right? And our ministry sorting out. But the church is growing outside the United States, a huge influx of delegates, and the General Conference made the decision, the growth was so fast coming in that they decided to step in the votes from outside the U.S., particularly from Africa, because if they just did something died. If they just did, I could switch to this one.
Yeah, that'd probably be the simpler.
Can you still hear me? Is that better? All right. I'll do that. It didn't really match my outfit anyway. By the way, I'm wearing my spring colors today in defiance of the weather. So I woke up this morning and I thought I'm just going to wear a springtime. So I can still talk with both hands, so I don't have to hold it. Where was I? We were stepping in, yes, the delegates, because if we just did straight population based on the number of clergy and the number of members, the U.S. would have been the minority vote about 12 years ago. And so by stepping it in to kind of balance how it was coming in, that's the only reason that the U.S. still has about 55% of the votes, and about 45% are from outside the U.S. The actual numbers already are about 55% outside the U.S. and 45% in. That's going to be very relevant when I talk about some of the legislation that's coming before the General Conference. So that's how we got to where we are. It's not, and I try to tell people all the time, because we've lost, we've talked about the disaffiliations. A lot of people from the right have left. We've been losing people from the left. Anyone know anyone in our families who have left because of the discriminatory language that we still have in our book of discipline and the discriminatory practices? We've lost a lot of people from the left. We've been leaking people for a really long time. And I try to remind people, it's not that the United Methodist Church in the United States is discriminatory, it's that we have this interesting structure and then people go blah, 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 right? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter to a lot of people why, just that it is. And so here we are. We have had petitions every single year to try to change this language, to try to take out the discriminatory language, and to have full inclusion for LGBTQ persons in the church through ordination and marriage. And the challenge has been not being able to get it through the General Conference. And so what has happened is different annual conferences in different local churches and different pastors have just been ignoring it, which is fine for a season. In fact, if you look at every policy of the United Methodist Church that has changed, it changed in part because people were no longer following it. And so there were a lot of places where there used to be a time when women couldn't be ordained. Well, people were ordaining women anyway. So finally the General Conference said, okay, we're tired of looking away, we'll just make it okay, 1956. The same with divorced pastors. Couldn't be divorced, they were tired of looking away, they said, okay, you can be divorced. When my dad was ordained in 1965, he had to sign a statement that said he would not drink alcohol or smoke tobacco. I think they would add more things to the smoking ban now if they still had it. But they got tired of looking away, and they decided that's not necessary anymore either. So all of the provisions that have changed in the church have come because people were not following them. So the argument that, oh my gosh, something new is happening and people are not following the discipline, it's not the first time, but it's eminently problematic. It's problematic to continue to ask to put the burden on our bishops and on our pastors to have to actually walk in contradistinction to the Book of Discipline in order to reach our mission field. So this is how we kind of got to where we are. Right now, we have an opportunity. We have three things that are on the docket. There are three primary legislative priorities for General Conference 2024. And these will be on the test, so pay attention. The biggest one is regionalization. And regionalization simply means that every region of the world, all the central conferences outside the United States and the United States would be able to make their own decisions about these exact issues. Because in Africa, we have churches in 26 different countries. In 16 of those countries, homosexuality is illegal. And in some of those, not only illegal, but punishable by prison, and in 3 countries, death. So when we talk about ordination and marriage in this country, folks in Africa it doesn't make any sense. It's a long way from where their culture is. So regionalization would allow regional decision making. The part that's the most frustrating about that is Africa already has regional decision making. There's a paragraph 101 in our Book of Discipline that was passed in 2012 that gave most of the Book of Discipline into regional control so that different regions of the country could organize themselves. You'd be surprised to know most of the Book of Discipline is for the U.S. church, and it was too complicated and unhelpful for most of the country, or most of the world, and so they were, and it might be for most of the country too, I'm just saying, but for the rest of the world, I want my bishop to know how much I support the Book of Discipline, except for several key parts. But putting it into regional control made sense because at that time, the international church was still a minority vote, and it didn't make sense that the majority should control the minority in a completely different culture, right? Now the tide has changed, and it's this historical context that now the U.S. church is going to be the minority, but we're still in our structure the main church, and everyone else is ancillary. Well, that's not a really Christian structure anyway. This colonial structure that we have, that the U.S. church is the mothership and everyone else are little ducklings, that might have flown in the 1950s, but it's not okay now. But we don't have a structure that recognizes that. In order to make the U.S. equal to the other parts of the world, we have to change the Constitution. And we need 8 constitutional votes. So regionalization is very important because it would allow for the U.S. to make its own decisions about ordination and marriage, and it would let Africa make its own decisions. No one is suggesting that we should impose gay marriage and gay ordination in Africa
in a place where that doesn't make sense right now. So, but the challenge is to allow the US to do that. So regionalization is critically important. The challenge with regionalization is it takes not just a majority vote, it takes a 2/3 vote. And while we have 55% of the votes, that's not 2/3. And so we have to get to 2/3, which means there's gonna need to be a general consensus in the church, not just an agreement. There's gotta be a consensus that we can live together with difference. Now, the challenge is going to be, even if we get the 2/3 vote at General Conference, all constitutional amendments, similar to the US Constitution, have to be ratified by the annual conferences. And that means every member of every annual conference present and voting. So we have to get 2/3 there. Now remember, we don't have 55% of the votes anymore. When that goes out, it goes to the population count that is real, and we only have 45% of those votes. So if there's not an overwhelming consensus in Africa and the Philippines and Europe to do this, there's no chance that it passes ratification, and it takes a year. So one of the difficult outcomes could be we could pass regionalization at General Conference and it not get ratified in the time afterwards. Has this ever happened before? Yes. In 2012, we did pass a regionalization plan. It died at ratification. In 2016, we passed a radical piece of legislation that said women are equal to men in the eyes of God. I know that's stepping out on a limb. It got 2/3 vote at General Conference, and it did not pass ratification. So, just so you know, I'm going to say it's hard. And so and one of the things that has happened is the conservative advocacy groups have made every vote at General Conference a proxy vote on homosexuality. So regionalization, pro-regionalization is pro-gay, anti-regionalization is anti-gay. This black and white binary thinking, which we struggle with in the church and we struggle with in our national politics, is what every vote has come down to. So regionalization has failed on these terms historically. So that's one piece of legislation. The next piece of legislation that's important is removing the harmful language, including repealing the traditional plan, which calls for increased trials. One of the things the U.S. Church is done with, and this is for folks who are left of center, right of center, everyone's done with the trials. The whole idea that we're going to put clergy on trials for doing gay weddings, that we're going to put gay pastors on trial, and then we're going to ask them in trial, are you a practicing homosexual? And then we have to decide what that means. I mean, it's outrageous. So to eliminate the traditional plan that was passed in 2019, we have to repeal all of that. We need to remove the incompatibility language. So it comes in two phases. One phase is there's revised general social principles for the church. The new social principles for the church will remove the incompatibility language. So we need to pass that. The second part is repealing the rest of the traditional plan, the chargeable offenses, the funding ban. I can tell you in 2016, there was a vote in committee, there was a petition to put money to encourage the general church and annual conferences to put money towards preventing teen suicide among gay teenagers. Because gay teenagers commit suicide at 5 times the rate of other teenagers. That petition failed because it was prohibited by the funding ban that we can't promote the gay agenda. Keeping gay kids from killing themselves ought to be all of our agenda. Amen? Amen. That failure, we've got to repeal that. We've got to repeal that. So, regionalization's 1, repealing the language is 2. The good news about repealing the language is it's only a majority vote. We failed in 2019, the One Church plan, which would have removed this language and allowed us all to live together in our difference. The One Church plan failed by 50 votes. We needed 26 people to change their mind. 26 people changed their mind and voted the other way, it would have passed. Well, following the 2019 General Conference, annual conferences, there was an uprising in this country and we voted out a lot of traditional delegates and put in a lot of centrists and progressives. We picked up 26 votes just in 2019. We've picked up additional votes with the disaffiliation because we've had 25% of the churches leave. A lot of those delegates have left and they've been backfilled with new delegates who are centrist or progressive. So we have more than the votes that we need in order to remove the language. The biggest hindrance to removing the language is there are some delegates, and we're working on this with Mainstream, who believe that if we remove the language, then ratification won't happen for regionalization. So there's a group that wants to not vote to remove the language yet, wait 4 more years, and hope that regionalization passes. I would suggest we have to remove the language now. We have to remove the language now. We can't afford, we've lost 25% of the churches from the right because we're going to remove the language. We can't afford to lose any more from the center and the left. So we have to remove the language now. The risk is if regionalization doesn't pass in 2028, it could be put back in. That's problematic. We're not there yet, we're just here. So regionalization, removing the language with a majority, I'm very confident we can remove the language this time if we can keep our coalition together. The third thing is there's a group that wants to extend the disaffiliations. Now, the Kansas City metro area was not hit hard with disaffiliations. There are other annual conferences that were hit much harder. We have the same split in the United Methodist Church as, well, I should say we had the same split in the United Methodist Church as we have nationally with politics. The urban centers are more progressive, the rural areas are more conservative, the north and the coasts are more progressive, the south is more conservative, and that's how the disaffiliations have played out. The Great Plains Conference lost 250 churches, about 25% of our churches, but we only lost, I think, 2 with over 400 in attendance. It was mostly the rural churches in western Nebraska and western Kansas. And I've talked to church folks out in those areas as I've done this work at Mainstreams, and they're like, I don't think our church could have a gay pastor. And I always tell them, you know, good news and bad news. The good news is no gay pastor wants to come out to your town. So you're just gonna have to let that soak in. And the bad news is there just aren't enough gay pastors to go around. Not everybody gets one. So if a church isn't asking for a gay pastor, there aren't gonna be one. So folks don't need to worry about this. But we do have this regional divide and geographic divide around. So the Kansas City area was not hit hard by disaffiliations. There are groups, the conservative advocacy groups, want to extend the disaffiliation season again. So paragraph 2553 was the language that allowed churches to leave because they disagreed with the stance on homosexuality. It's the only reason you can leave is about the gay issue. And that expired in December 31st of last year. So it just expired a couple weeks ago. Well, they say it wasn't fair. There are more people that want to leave. We need to extend it. The reality is churches, there have always been churches that have left the denomination now and again. There are provisions for that. Annual conferences can negotiate something similar to 2553 if they wanted. My belief is we should not reopen it, and we should end the season of disaffiliations. The divorce is final. Every church that's anti-gay has left. We've had a lot of collateral damage of churches that don't like fighting. I mean, who does? And this is the issue. Anybody seen a church fight? I know no one here's ever participated in one. But one of the things about a church fight is there are people who leave who aren't even in the fight. Like, there's this group fighting for the blue carpet and this group fighting for the red carpet. This group doesn't even care the color of the carpet, but they leave anyway because they hate the fight. Folks, we've had a lot of collateral damage in the United Methodist Church of people leaving the church just because they're tired of the fight. And extending the disaffiliations would simply continue these contentious votes. Now, a church like Asbury, I trust you didn't have a vote. The churches that did vote are still struggling with the outcome of that, regardless of how that vote went down. Because whether the vote was 25% or 50%, it had to be 60% it really caused division among us. I will tell you, I've never been in a church where everyone believed the same thing or agreed with me. I did offer every congregation I pastored the opportunity to agree with me. Amen? Because I just think the world would be a better place if everybody thought just like I did. Had a hard time getting that agreement across the dinner table. But I do think that the fighting has taken a toll on our church, and the struggle, particularly the last generation of going to General Conference every year and being in the news for fighting about homosexuality again. One, I think gay people are pretty done being the center of attention here. And I think the harm that we've done just in this fight has been extensive, and we need to stop it. So ending the disaffiliation season and not renewing it, the only people who want to renew it are people who are advocating for the Global Methodist Church and want more churches to join them. So we need to end it. The fighting's over, but it's going to be a key piece of legislation. And there are two groups within the centrist progressive coalition that we have. One says, and this is largely coming from northern and coastal areas that were not hit hard by disaffiliations, who would say, well, we should extend the disaffiliations because we shouldn't hold anybody hostage. Anyone that doesn't want to be in our denomination should leave. I hear that argument. Others would say, and I would say most of us, particularly those of us who have been in annual conferences who were hit hard by disaffiliations, we don't want to extend that. So we want to stop the disaffiliations. The folks who needed to leave have left. The other key group, not only people who don't like to fight, a lot of opportunists left. There were a lot of folks who just saw that they could get their property out from under the conference, and they could hire and fire their pastor without talking to the bishop. Half the churches that have left have gone independent. They didn't want to go Global Methodist. They are not interested in being a part of a denomination, and so they have gone independent. I'm not interested in reopening legislation for local churches to fight and to support churches that just want to go independent. If you want to go independent, you can. You should negotiate that with your conference, and you can sort it out. So, but it's going to be a big push, and our coalition is not of one mind. So our coalition is not of one mind on all three of these issues. We have pretty broad support for regionalization, though there's a growing frustration with the international church within the United States. There's a broad support for removing the language. There is some strategic concern about what that will do to regionalization. And there is broad support for not continuing disaffiliations, but there's still a concern that we should, on principle, allow people to leave who want to, right? So, our work at Mainstream is to identify who's who, because we need to count the votes, right? I used to say as mayor, the only IQ necessary to be mayor of Kansas City, Kansas is the ability to count to 6. If you can't count to 6, you can't be mayor. So, or you can't successfully be mayor. We have to count to 432, right, in order to pass the majority legislation, and then we have to be able to count. I have to get the number in my head for what 2/3 is, but the 2/3 of General Conference is a drop in the bucket compared to what we need for ratification. So those are the proposals that are coming. It's a little bit about how we got here, a little bit about the proposals. The work we're going to be doing for the next 3 months. General Conference is in 3 months, which is a little terrifying. But General Conference is in 3 months, and the work that Mainstream is doing, we're trying to bring our coalition all on the same page for the topics, these 3 topics. There are 5,000 petitions. I mean, there's 2 books this thick each. Remember phone books? Y'all remember the good old Kansas City phone books? My last use for a phone book was in Denver in seminary, and I had the white pages and yellow pages, because if I stacked them on top of each other and put them underneath my green chair, it wouldn't rock over backwards. So I did have some good use for phone books, but we don't even have them anymore. But we still have this much legislation, 5,000. One of the things we're doing is sorting through all of that, because most of it, okay, every petition's important. But there's some that are less important than others, right? There are 3 big topics, and they have a bunch of petitions just themselves. We need to focus on those, and then we need to identify the others for folks so we don't need to get lost in it, because it's very easy to get lost I mean, this is every class, isn't it? If you've ever taken, you get lost in the book and you miss the theme, you miss the thesis, you miss the key points. The key, that what we're trying to do is sift all the legislation for folks so you can see the key points and we can focus on that. And we should spend 80% of the general conference time and energy on those three things. And we should spend 20% of the time on everything else. And everything else includes the budget. So I'll say this one last thing and then I'm gonna break to questions. And this is the last article I just put out this last week. The elephant in the room is money. 99.4% of the entire global budget comes from the US churches. 99.4%. Pre-COVID, that was $134 million. Well, we're gonna have about a 40% reduction. We're gonna be looking at about an $80 to $85 million budget going forward. That's the annual budget just for the denominational stuff outside the annual conferences and local churches. There's a growing sentiment in the US church that we believe we should fund the bulk of the global church. From those who have much, much will be required. Surely we've preached on this here at Asbury. I would recommend it if you haven't. But there's a growing sentiment we're not willing to fund a church that is constraining our outreach to our local mission field. We're not going to fund a church that's constraining our outreach to our local mission field. That's a really hard thing to say, and it gets very messy, but it's also real. The U.S. church is hurting. We need to end the harm so that we can move forward and fully fund and embrace the global church. So